Mine. We are now recording.
Got it. Just in case any brilliant thing
if something shoots off, we should probably, it's good to have it.
May forget. Yeah.
No doubt.
But yeah, I was just going through your iCoin. And yeah, I mean, it just makes perfect sense, and especially in terms of that wave function. So, you know, I mean, I don't know, it's beautiful. I want to know more about how that integrates with the rest of the UTOK vision, but yeah,
right.
But I understand so far, I love.
Yeah, I mean, the real short version, then we could maybe talk I'd like to get a little bit of your background just to kind of locate you in coordinates, and be happy to share my background.
Sure.
But the short answer is that, so the way this UTOK vision has evolved as a synthetic philosophy is then organized into sort of three portals of onto-epistemology. One is the tree of knowledge, and that's science. So it's a new vision of big history. So we say, oh, what does scientific objectivity say about the world? And the tree of knowledge then maps that. Then you have sort of what is that would be logos, by the way, in Bard's system. Then you get sort of the garden is mythos, essentially, in relationship to sort of what's our collective intelligent frames that afford us ethical ways of being in the world, that afford us a particular orientation towards collective wisdom and sort of storied sense making in a metaphorically but deep, rich mythos sort of way. And the coin then represents the subjective position, basically your phenomenological, idiographic, subjective position of being in the world. You know, so your epistemological portal as a unique individual, or dividual to use Bard's term, my dividual specific portal. And UTOK affords a new way to harmonize the objective, intersubjective, and subjective, or logos, mythos, pathos frames of knowing.
Gotcha. So when we talk about the iCoin, and we talk about, for instance, waveform function, we're talking more about personal transcendence and or personal travel through life, through experience, ontological experience.
Yep. Yes, okay. That is the first part of it is the subjective field of being. That's the initial grounding of it. Okay. Now, the origin of iQuad is this thing called the equivalency. And the equivalency I built or landed on, or I could tell you about that back in 2001. And the equivalency has to do actually with the way the tree of knowledge in unified theory, but back then it was just tree of knowledge, affords the capacity to see the way quantum mechanics and general relativity align the energy information fields of the universe, basically. So there is a pretty clear linkage, ultimately, a deep linkage between the subjective knower and the objective fields down the road. But in terms of the entry point into it, it's your idiosyncratic subjective field of being.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I align with that. I mean, you know, that's what fundamentally anchors my love for emergence, you know.
Yep. And actually it's on an oscillating wave function, by the way, that it does that. So in terms of your depiction, I was like, fuck, it's an oscillating wave function that I got to that point. So I saw your depiction, I'm like, damn, that's badass.
You got there the same way. Yeah, so the way that I got there is pretty interesting, actually. I haven't had a chance to tell this story yet fully. I was going to do it on the Stoic recently, but I decided we had technical difficulties, and then we're like, let's make a movie instead. So in music in the 90s, there was something called the Loudness Wars. And so in 1937, a compressor, the first sonic compressor, was invented. And for the very first time, engineers started lifting the valleys, the depressions and the amplitudes up to the peaks through compression, so that you had more loudness more of the time. And you could also, obviously, you prevented distortion by compressing the waveform, but you compressed it so that you could raise the valleys higher up into the peaks and create a more consistent waveform. Anyway, once that digitized in the 90s, the compression capacities became like really, really intense.
Okay.
And so you ended up with these waveforms prior to 1999 that were hyperdynamic, beautiful, dynamism,
Right.
alive. And then starting with like Californication, Rick Rubin produced this, whatever that band's name is, Red Hot Chili Peppers album. And if you look at the waveform, it's actually online because there's just like this, that's the start of this Loudness Wars. It is an actual, just the whole album is a flat line, and the only depressions are in between songs. And otherwise, the whole album is a flat line. And then this peaked, no pun intended, around 2003, right when my first band was starting. And I remember we got this mixer, and his name's Chris Lord Algae, and he made everything really loud. So we were right in the middle of these Loudness Wars. Every band wanted all their stuff to be just as loud as others. So this got me thinking about life, dynamism, and then compression being related to flatlining. And this idea of a compressed totality being equivalent to nothing, to what we call in music the noise floor. So in music, the noise floor is that piece that it's like quantum noise. You just can't get rid of it. You're trying to maximize the noise to floor ratio, but you cannot ever get rid of the floor. Well, what a giant compressed song looks like is a noise floor. If you zoom into noise floor, you see all of this activity. And, and I started seeing this equivalency between zero and totality. And I was like, wow, the compressed saturated totality is equivalent in terms of just like noise to floor ratio to nothing. And so, or at the very least, I was intrigued by the idea that enough dynamism yielded no dynamism, and or enough compression rather. And then I start thinking about gravity, and I start thinking about Planck stars, black holes, and I'm thinking about compression and information, and pretty soon I start to build this theory of waveform functionality eventually oscillating toward a sort of phase shift, and that the way those phase shifts happen is by a sort of saturation of the waveform function that then yields a new equilibrium, a new flat line around which a new waveform function then begins to oscillate. And so that serves as the sort of like,
That's badass. I love that. No, I can, I have to metabolize that a little bit, but immediately that's got a particular form to it that I can, jam with, as it were, although I don't do music.
Well, I'll send you, I'm glad you can kind of visualize it, because sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's easier to just show, but I'll send you some other things. And what's interesting about it, and what I like about your focus on one, 0 to the 0th power debated, but some people say it's 1. Anything else to the 0th power is 0. And what I like about this idea of 1 is that if we reverse the idea of emergence, and we take a look at technology and development and the compression of our waveforms from, oh, we have an individual here. Oh, more individual, all of a sudden we're in capitalism, now everyone's an individual, and you end up with a flattened waveform again. You end up with no dynamism vis-a-vis total dynamism. So when I start thinking about these advents of technology and our attitude toward them, we always sort of view these things as interminable, inexorable advancements. Actually, a lot in IDW, it's very rare that anyone that sticks up for, hey, why don't we go back to vitalism or something? Everyone's like, you're crazy, because you can never go back, you can always go forward. And I'm curious as to why that's our mentality, why that's essentially a compulsion. I feel like we very much have a compulsion forward. And if we think about it, I started thinking about it in terms of reversing, so that instead of a push toward, instead of an emergence, it's a pull. And what if these compressions that we end up saturating ourselves into, vis-a-vis like a quantitative thresholds that we exceed, what if these compressions that exist in our future are actually pulling us towards them? And so that these zeros ahead of ourselves are actually in our mind, and that our desire for them is what triggers the first sort of negative that creates the positive, that creates the waveforms, that these continued visions of an ideal togetherness or an ideal impression is what ends up generating these sort of these waveform functions. And eventually, theoretically, they would lead to a final pull. So if this is all a pulling instead of a pushing, which would mimic something like a Planck star or a sort of gravitational hypercompression that is pulling everything into it, creating a uniformity that then, as I think we basically, people are starting to sort of agree on, maybe physicists, that as soon as information gets to that, nearing Planck scale, it immediately then explodes back out. The information is sort of maintained. So again, another wave function, but we have this sort of this pull toward, this thing is pulling us in, and it doesn't, I don't mean that necessarily totally literally, but that we have this figurative memory, forward-looking memory of this totalized state that we may be compelled towards.
I actually, that jives a lot with at least, at a reasonable level of abstraction, but also something that I can completely sync up with in relation to what the unfolding wave of complexification that's mapped by the tree of knowledge and the overarching garden. So essentially, there are, it's a little different. One of the things I'd say is that in terms of the complexity and the physics of complicated states, okay, is different than black hole states. So a complexified state. But there are a lot of parallels. In fact, I say like the Earth is burns like a quasar of complexity in the night sky. All right. And there are, I believe, certainly you can argue the thing called the elephant sun god that sits over the garden. And that's an icon of Syntheos, or at least the god of light good concept. Okay. And I certainly would argue that the human organization of what is good can be really thought about as being pulled to that in a particular kind of way. And that's a singularity of goodness in a particular way. And it has to do with a compression in many ways of the kinds of things that afford complex adaptive flourishing into some ideal harmonizing unity that affords that. And then the imagery of that and the pull to that, or at least the projection of it, John Vervaeke would call it the projection of your divine double, basically. And then that projection creates an actual ideal discrepancy that then orients the sense of conscience or the sense of value or the sense of virtue in that regard. So certainly for me, without making any ontological claims about the nature of that entity, the idea that it's a projection that then pulls us toward it is a very reasonable kind of frame of reference.
Yeah, and that brings up something else that I think, actually, I wanted to bring this up to you months and months ago, after you first presented the tree, because I had an idea that I think dovetails with it. So that idea of we have this idea, we project it out, and then we start putting our attention into it. And if we could just for a moment suspend disbelief and imagine that the attention that we're putting into something is real stuff. And that thing is a defined mascot. Let's say it's a word, or it's an idea, or it's a term. And the more we put our attention into it, the further it saturates, the further it compresses, the further it condenses, the more gravity it contains to then drag us towards it. And in that density and sort of gravitational compression, this Lacanian idea of the synthtone, which, this idea of like this unanalyzable state of an idea, the unanalyzable state through sort of these are now my words entirely, but through a compression of attention. So we have something like, let's just say socialism, or let's say freedom. And we throw all our attention into it. Now, let's say freedom had all of these nuanced meanings at one time, and then eventually through attention, the mascot itself sort of concretizes and becomes the waveform functions basically collapse, and it becomes this sort of unanalyzable solid, this sort of synthomeme sort of thing. And anyway, I was just thinking about the various philosophical ideas that we have, and we put our attention into them, and then the ones that gain a lot of steam end up losing their nuance. I mean, everywhere, the most popular things have the least nuance because they're the least understood. They become hot button, flags and these sorts of things.
Yep.
So
nice.
Anyway, we create this God, we put enough attention into it until it becomes unanalyzable, sort of a apophatic God that we cannot define any longer because of the saturation of meaning we've put into it. We suddenly now can no longer define it. And so when I think of the apple in the Garden of Eden, and you have this garden, and the apple of knowledge, and the apple being this sort of smooth, unanalyzable object that contains all of this stuff. And you think of the apple as sort of this compression of our intention, and possibly of a prior or God himself, or whatever the case is. But there's something to the compression of an apple, and the apple containing the seed to everything. And there's something in there that I liked. Yeah.
Beautiful. A couple thoughts there. So what you just described, in my estimation, about the saturation and then the thing, and then is essentially the way I would describe what happened to the institution of psychology.
Wow.
Okay. So in other words, like science happened. And of course, prior science, people wondered about psyche and all this other shit. But then science happened, and physics and biology started happening. And then people were like, well, fuck, we'll take whatever this epistemology of modern science is and jam it to whatever people think this thing called psychology, mind, psyche is. And then then all these people jammed themselves into it. And actually, they couldn't grab the center of it, but they collapsed the institutional structure around it, and then sort of created this, what I then discovered to be basically a black hole. And I mean that conceptually, but a black hole of understanding. And then they were like, well, fuck that. There is no center, but there is the institutional interest and the diversity around the black hole center that is the institution itself. And you get there through science, and psychology is the science of application, behavior, and mental process. And that's just what it is. And anyone can define behavior and mental process however the fuck they like. Here are your schools of thought, and you can never actually really decide what it is. And then I kind of came along, got somehow into the black hole, re-rotated it. And it's like, oh my God, no, there's animal mental behavior, human mental behavior, subjectivity, objective science, and the profession. It's like, oh no, there's logic inside of here. But the field itself was already imploded around chaos. And people are like, well, fuck it, we're already committed to this, and who the hell cares what you say? And it might make sense, but it's not like we're going to do anything about it. And I was like, I thought the whole fucking thing was to make sense out of the world. It's like, no, the institution. So actually now I'm like on the outside saying, we got to blow the whole fucking thing up.
And reestablish. That's what happens, right? Is these things become, something like that becomes too dense. Someone like you comes along and is like, wait a minute, this is dense. You can't make sense of it anymore. It's unanalyzable. And then you blow it up, just like a fucking plank star. You blow it up, and just like we can't stay. It's like that cartoon where the girl gets a little doll and it's like, I'm gonna love you and it's like you want the love, but then you have someone loving you too much, and suddenly you got to get the fuck out. So the saturation, the compressed saturation requires that explosive response, I think. And yeah, what do you call that again? The problem of psychology. The
problem of psychology, right? Which is basically, everybody in theoretical psychology really knows this, but nobody else talks about it. So, I mean, it was known in the 1920s. It was a documented, which is basically like, you're talking about behavior, you're talking about neurocognition, you're talking about subjective, you're talking about animals, you're talking about people. is it a more applied? Is it more basic? What's its relationship to biology? All the schools of thought answer all those fucking questions in different ways. Okay. Right. So that's the issue. And then the field decided you couldn't answer that question. And so then what it said is, well, what we do is we identify as scientists, at least mainstream academic Western psychology, we identify as scientists. And what psychology is the application of the epistemology of science to this issue. So it's a methods-based answer rather than an ontological-based answer. And that's and then I figured out the tree of knowledge is actually, no, that's an ontological, clear metaphysical system that affords an ontology that people are missing. And we should fucking define it by the ontological reference point of what the fuck we're talking about in nature, rather than, all scientists are based on the scientific method at some level. To define ourselves as like we apply the scientific method and that's what makes us a science is lame. That's like a science about what?
No. And then, you're just sort of slaving away on behalf of, I think that's, like when I first read the way you were posing it, my knee-jerk was, well, psychology has become the sort of R&D arm of advertising.
It did become, exactly. When they invented behaviorism, and then behaviorism actually had real quick application. It was grounded in a scientific methodology. And ultimately the entire, if you Tristan Harris's, oh my God, the social dilemma, all those fucking algorithms are basically, we can track what people do and we vary what they do, and then we'll select what they do based on the environmental design of the interface system. And we will pull people's attention and behavior, and then we'll be able to make money off of that. In my system, it's the behavioral investment principle. It's like, the fundamental principle of behavioral investment is you expend energy, and then if you get what you're short-term looking for, you jolt a reward and you tend to do that more. That's a short-term, then you have to then you got short-term, long-term problems. It's like, oh, fuck, I'm going to just spend a day on TikTok. Fuck that.
Sometimes I look at the hours that I've spent. I'm like, no way. I did not spend 9 hours today on my phone. Yeah, it's amazing. The phone itself being sort of an attentional compression of
right.
It's very, 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 very McLuhan situation we have going.
Totally. Well, the tree of knowledge shows this too, because it says, hey, you want the real emergent jumps. There's lots of different shit that happens with emergence, but the fundamental issues are compressions. You can put it this way. Because what happens is you get a new language system, and with life you get a genetic cell language system. With mind you get a nervous system animal language system. With people you get a language system, and now we fucking built the digital language system. So we now interface our justification systems with technology across medium structures around the world, and now we're like, what the fuck? We're in a totally another complex adaptive mediated by the digital plane, and that's the god of Syntheos for Bard. And it's like, well. Fuck, how are we going to navigate the oscillations around this thing? Because it's going to create compressions and explosions in a pretty crazy way. So let's get it right.
I know. That's I think that idea of like, is there any agency? And if there is agency, I think it may be in the visioning of which zeros, to use my language, like which zeros we are steering ourselves towards, or
beautiful,
which compressions we want to head toward. And to the extent that we do have agency, then we can, we can manufacture, like, so for instance, this idea of a Syntheos, or the idea of a return to, I'd actually be curious to hear from your perspective, like, what is the ultimate benefit of being able to put our, is it a sort of Girardian mimetic sort of like averting sort of total disaster? Like, what's the ontological benefit for you of the Syntheos? I get that you have an analysis, the tree of knowledge, and UTOK system is sort of an analysis of everything that's happening, but then you have this extra quality that is something, this thing we're going, that we could go towards. And that towardsness is sort of like an agency mechanism, or what
sure.
does that mean?
Well, so a couple of things. Yeah, ultimately the product, UTOK, if you want to, sort of the way I'm quickly summarizing it now, is about getting right relation with is and ought. Okay. So, and the tree, and there's a lot of science stuff. and self-reflective stuff to clear up self-deception, use good epistemologies, get a field of base reality that corresponds as best as possible to the world as it is relative to our identification with it, and get good self-world relations on that. And that's the sort of descriptive scientific side. And then the humanistic side is there are different valued states of being, so I'm a clinician. When I've worked with, 15-year-olds who are neurotic and their boyfriend breaks up with them and they're like, actually, I'm going to slit my wrist and kill myself. Okay. And I've worked with other, and then I've had moments of wisdom energy where I'm like, oh my God, I'm so thankful to be alive as part of the universe in relation. And I just feel it to my cells, a deep sense of bliss. It's like, well, we just started egoic rationalism. It's like, fuck, I don't want to be, I don't want to be in Auschwitz, and I don't want to be slitting my wrist because I'm so filled with psychache that I want to escape all existence on the one hand. And I'd rather be in a state of bliss. Okay. So so the early easy thing is what I generate as a valued states of being, and then be like, well, it makes sense to be oriented toward valued states of being at a particular level. So that's sort of an egoic rationalism. It's like better to be hanging around with my family and loving each other than on a fucking train to Auschwitz. You don't need a lot of justification as to why that's the case. And then you kind of like, then at a higher abstract level, it's sort of like, okay, yeah, what is ultimate valued states of being in relation? And that's part of what UTOK then, it's a wisdom philosophy that then basically says, given human nature, the situation that we're in, the place in the cosmos, it offers a particular kind of framing on sage-like living and valued states of being and a path to it. It identifies the elephant sun god as just an icon that overlaps as an integrated pluralistic way with many of the other religious states that identify some wise, transcendent, good, true, beautiful state of being. And so it then says, yeah, no, actually an integrated pluralistic alignment with that it makes good sense. And we definitely need that relative to our current knowledge, wisdom states.
And so do you have is there an arrival point then? Is the elephant arrivable?
No, I mean, the elephant for me, that's literally sort of like some transcendent God state. You get the elephant shine. So like, I was at the Stowe, I did wisdom energy. I can't remember if you were there or not, or the other one I was at. Yeah. Right. So I'm at the Stowe talking about so in October, I have a 3-week transcendent period. I make a logos insight, and that a logos insight actually affords a particular kind of transcendence. I entered into a transcendent hypomanic, but actually dropped out of justification state of being. Okay. And then that gave me some clarity in the language of UTOK. Basically, I had opened up an experience of the divine. Okay, and was finding the unity, the transcendent unity of self and world in beautiful relation, and then was experiencing the bliss off of that. And that's very consistent with many different sort of, especially Eastern meditative traditions about what happens as people gain various levels of enlightenment. So for me, that affords a particular kind of description. And yeah, it says absolutely, again, that is a cultivating the capacity of that relative to say, my life has no purpose, I never experience any meaning, I'm totally alone. Again, you basically I'm a psychotherapist, so I always am often embedded in the real world of flourishing in misery. And I have a pretty caring, I'm dispositionally a pretty caring heart. That's why I went to become a healer. And it's just sort of like when I see fucking people living underneath bridges, giving blowjobs for $5, my heart aches for that. That fucking sucks.
Yeah, I was, I hear you. I've been down and out in my day. That's cool that you had those such transcendent experiences. This was just in October?
Yeah, I've had others, but virtually this was the first.
This most recent one you're referring
The most recent one was October, and it was by far the most. Almost all my other ones are more. My energy is through logos and justification. I'm trained as a scientist, and I have talents in that regard, and I'm Westerner. So all those things confirm to create a particular energy and way of being in the world. And this one the coolest thing about this one was it seems like I got about as hot as trans justificatory, certainly as I've been. In other words, I certainly have a sort of, as a psychotherapist, a metacognitive person, transcended egoic normal functioning. But this was like transcending the egoic mode into simply wandering around with my dog Benji in the neighborhood and just literally feeling like the real sun was the sun god beaming on me, just almost in a dreamlike state. You know, it was just sort of like, oh my God, the blues are beautiful. The greens are beautiful. All these houses are beautiful. Everyone's thinking the world is so horrible. And I'm like, this is the most beautiful place to be in the universe. Yeah. And it wasn't even verbal. It was just embodied.
Yeah, that's cool. So in the iQuad, so I to the fourth power is the way I understand it. It's basically the full circuit. It's -1,
exactly.
1.
So it symbolizes the complex unit plane circle. Yeah. You know, that's if you draw the unit circle on a complex plane, the vertical is I, usually the I versus negative I dimension, and then the real is the 1 versus -1. You draw a circle around that. That's called the complex unit circle. And the I to the fourth, one way, if you draw it in terms of rotation, I to the fourth then gets drawn as you start at I, and then you go to -1, you go to negative I, and then you go to 1. And the fourth point on that completes the circle. Yeah. And so that's one of the symbolisms that it gives.
Right. 1 to I to -1 to negative I to 1 to, it's exactly. Great. And then that relates to the waveform. But in terms of, I can't remember your equation, but so in terms of what it equals, obviously it equals 1, and it equals the completion, and that means something. But in terms of depicting transcendence or to the next state, do you view iQuad as containing the transcendence, and each renewal to the 1 is sort of marks the transcendent moment and then it begins again, or is there something more? What do you think?
There's more to it than that. I mean, but that's a reasonable, especially in seeing yours and other kinds of elements. There's sort of the technical trail of logic that I followed, which was not that. And then there's the metaphorical matrices that follow around it that allow it to be a particular kind of symbol that then you can sort of project and then relate to. So I would consider what you just said the latter, in the sense that absolutely, that I can certainly see that, and that fits. And this is supposed to part of the, the reason it's a fucking garden is, it's like Garden of Eden, project onto that what you want and decide where the apple is and all that other shit. The actual, I'll tell you what the actual history of the concept is in 2000. The story is this. So I have the tree of knowledge, okay? And the tree of knowledge, at least as far as I was concerned, I built it in 1997. It shifted. I was really focused on what it meant for psychology for the first 2 years, 1997, 1999. By 1999, I shifted and was like, fuck, this maps the whole thing. I need to understand the entire ground, which means I went through biology, then into physics, okay? And then what I was like is, physics doesn't have a theory of physicists. Okay? And the physics does not have a theory of physicists. Okay. The operating assumption of physics and science is that you can use math and objective analysis and experimentation to get the knower completely out of the equation. Okay? Tree of knowledge says, no, actually, you need to put the knower in first and then realize how to factor her out. Okay. Sure. But you need to, so it's a totally different rotation it's like coming from behind physicists and including physicists into the equation, where physicists think they can get out of the equation. All right.
That reminds me of the many worlds theory, the idea that the superpositioned atom cannot just be entangled with the cat, and but rather everything that it's that's
right. So many worlds is another. Although I hate many worlds, I don't know, but it's a very good example of a fundamental shift, only this is a fundamental shift in ontology. They basically create a multiplicity of ontological lines, world lines. And then if you afford yourself a multiplicity of ontological world lines that are isolatable, you can then maintain the determinism that physicists want in relationship to what their things are, and just say each observer is located in a particular line world. And now you, by that shift, affords an enormous amount of consistency that resolves a huge number of the problems in relationship to what quantum mechanics says about the ontological reality and the measurement reality interface problem, which, you know, blew up physicists' minds. You know, my frame is many worlds is actually a very good description of the superposition and the non-Boolean, technically non-Boolean logic of the subatomic world. But actually, what we're seeing now, and if you understand quantum field theory and you understand coherent decoherence, essentially the coherent decoherence interface is when you jump into the macroscopic material dimension of existence, which is the standard what we interface with. And there's no reason, and there's never been any decent explanation about how you would actually divide the macroscopic world into these different world lines. Okay, so there's the, you know, that was always just fucking hand waving that, oh, every quantum jump happens to already have a predetermined world because of block world assumptions about determinism and everything else. And I, you know, sorry if I get all emotional, but I've been battling and annoyed with many worlds whenever I came across, and I had a couple of people who are like, no, this is good. In fact, fucking Sean Carroll is probably one of the most well-known sort of physicists. He's basically a worlder. Anyway, that's a.
I know he is. But just in terms of like the scientists being entangled with their science, obviously.
Yes. Well, that's so the interesting thing about both quantum mechanics and general relativity as it broke with classical mechanics. So classical mechanics certainly recognized that to understand the empirical world, you needed an observer and it was in relative position, but they basically assumed that there was a generalizable informational infrastructure of any observation that at various levels could see various systems from and not interfere with them, okay? And then general relativity and quantum mechanics in different ways, but both of them is very clearly stated that the relative position and nature of observer would afford an interference with the system in ways that broke our classical assumptions of space-time and the independence of the knower. So it's absolutely the case that the modern physics was completely entangled. The observer-observer relations got qualitatively more fucked and entangled with both of the twin pillars. And the nice thing about the tree of knowledge comes along and says, physicists never had a theory of the knower. They just have a theory of measurer and observer, but that's not the same thing as scientific knowledge. And that's where you get into all sorts of, well, is it measurement, is it observation, is it consciousness, is it who knows?
What's your opinion then? Is it waveform collapse, or and in that case, is it what is it? Why? Like, you know, I have a silly theory which is basically very, very elementary, but it's just the idea that there is no observer and observed. There's only exchangers. And two things are exchanging information at any given time. I don't glean from the tree. The tree gives me, we're interchanging, and that because of that, because I'm me and the tree is the tree. It's like I'm walking down the street and I say hello to one person that I don't know. They're going to say hello in a certain tone.
Yep.
I walk down the street, the same person sees someone else they really know and love, and a different tone comes out. Same thing with when we interact with particles. I'm this scientist, or it's this conditionality, it's this context, it's these instruments, I'm going to get this measurement. So the collapse is more indicative of an intersubjective uniqueness than it is of a particular condition that the particle contains and wants to express or contains in that condition, but in relation to the condition. And so, anyway,
I think so. There are a couple of different ways to answer that. So, at a general level, actually, John Vervaeke and I just did a book club on a book by Timothy Eastman, who is very well.
I got the book.
Oh, good.
I haven't started it, but I got it.
So, at the level of physics, in my estimation, his analysis, his modern Whiteheadian analysis, okay, of relationality, basically, And the way he describes the different contexts, the quantum, not, in fact, that's where I pulled non-Boolean versus Boolean. Okay, that's actually his, although he's pulling off of other people who have clearly developed this. So I don't really know who owns the term, but it doesn't fucking matter. The bottom line is that he affords a process view, okay, a Whiteheadian process view that in my does exactly what the unified theory and tree of knowledge was doing in my head in terms of the relation between the subatomic uncertainty at one level or superposition in a particular level and the interface, the input-output contextual interface that is entangled with various variables that commute in particular ways, like spin and position and momentum, and there are others. But fundamentally, that creates and the nature of the energy information field, which in my estimation just does not conform, and we shouldn't expect it to conform with the standard 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. It's essentially you want to talk about compression, a compression of vacuum energy possibilities that then essentially cohere or decohere, depending on which angle you put it on, into the macroscopic world. And it is that compression and coherence interface whereby you have one system that's operating in a particular kind of space-time behavioral propensity, and then you have another system that is stable, that's compressed, and that interface creates a weird field kind of relation.
I love this. So tell me if I'm explaining this correct, because this is how I envision hypertime, or this is how I try and convince Bard to interpret hypertime. But this is how I interpret the energy information field, and I think I'm describing what you just described. Basically, we would have let's just say we have the container of our universe. It is completely compressed and saturated to the point of total relation. So, and this is an important point to me. So the compression, by way of the quantitative threshold being surpassed and the qualitative shift, comprises a compression that is so saturated that you have effectively zero, but it's not zero in the way that people normally think of it. It's zero relation. Okay. So you have, sorry, let me say this again. Total relation, zero differential. You have zero differential, total relation. When you have total relation, you have zero differential, which means you have zero dynamism, which means you have zero difference, which means you have a backdrop. You have the ultimate noise floor. And if our universe is sufficiently saturated with energy information, however you want to describe it, it would then provide this equilibrium against which our waveforms, the waveforms of existence and the things we see from the quantum, subquantum, whatever, all the way on up, virtual particles, all of it, and provide our backdrop as sort of this equilibrium. Now, we can't see it, it's like, this isn't compressed. How can you tell me this is compressed? Well, it's like, it's hard to describe. But anyway, at that compression of total relata, that would explain entanglement. That's my point. Because at total relata, you have no differentiation, you have just one. And that's why I like the number 1 coming back in. You have at the end of the day, the ultimate magnetic zero, the final compression being the totality, and total relata yielding zero differential. Yeah.
Well, here's the way I would we'd probably have to spend some time really, but here's how I would follow that line of thought. Okay. So in quantum mechanics, one of the things they talk about is the law of conservation of information. Okay. Conservation of information basically means it really goes back to essentially Newton, action, reaction, symmetry. Okay. Action.
So the conservation of energy, but conservation of information, is it different?
They're different things. The conservation of energy is different than the conservation of information, although they're both laws in relation.
You're not talking thermodynamics right now.
No, we're not talking thermodynamics. And I'm not an expert. I'm not well versed in the nuances of the conservation of information, but it's a fundamental principle in quantum mechanics that, in essence, and I don't know all the circumstances which might be conserved or not. But if you remember the black hole problem, like that Penrose and Hawking, and then when they were the idea that the black hole would eat some information that you would never be able to get anything out of, well, that violated the law of conservation of information. And since it was such a fundamental law, people were like, what the fuck? We were violating a fundamental law. And they're like, no, actually echoes could be found. The echoes of action could be found. So the trail
they were just located, or it was just proved like super recently, like that. It's like
they basically agreed that my understanding of now, the recent solution is an adequate solution that says, no, the echo of action reaction affords us to say that the law of conservation of information is maintained, and the black hole doesn't eat it. And somebody lost a bet on that. They bet on, there's a famous bet. But let's take that idea that every action and reaction are embedded in a particular symmetrical relation, and let's just follow it all the way back into time. And if you follow everything back into time, what you get the collapse of the universe into the energy information superforce. I mean, all of the space-time collapses in the four fundamental forces collapse upon one another. And then you have a super force field of energy, pure radiation energy information that's super hot, super dense, and the beginning. Now, inside of that are all the quantum fluctuations in possible relation. Okay. Well, that's the super condensed state, but actually that is then at some level, at the conservation of information, at some level, that's a mirror image of what it is that's actually operating right here. Right?
Sure. So the differential information is maintained as opposed to congealed into zero differential.
Right. So at one level, that's true. At another level, obviously, there are different. This is why you have to be very careful of meaning of information, meaning for complexification. Obviously, the universe itself now is fundamentally different than it was at the Big Bang point, and it's happened. And all of our histories now describe particular informational states that didn't exist before. So from particular angles, the history of information unfolding was new, but the actual, each bit is a side of another side. And by the way, what you said also reminded me at the level of conservation of energy, most physicists would say that the energy state at that is zero. And what they mean by that is there's positive and negative energies that perfectly balance out. So this initial state of the universe is energy zero. And you could almost argue that, at least in relationship to where it is, the information complexification is zero, but the balance of it would be, and you compress it all back into that spot.
Well, and that zero, that equilibrium of information distribution within that tight, compressed state would be zero because of the compression would sort of squeeze, equally. I mean, the one thing that's interesting about energy, I mean, informational, at least in cybernetics, the idea of entropy and information is that the information loss represents informational entropy. So when something you communicate, and I like that just in the most workaday sense, like you communicate something to me, I glean some essence, and all the chat, whatever nuance I've lost, that's sort of the entropic, chat. And how much informational entropy is occurring at all times, and yet law of conservation, that entropy, that information still exists. It's just less useless to me. It's more useless to me. I suddenly have lost it, and we end up again coming back to this refinement. The more something, I like this actually as a theory of sort of mimetic exchange, that because of that game of telephone and the loss of information as information is exchanged, vis-a-vis the second law of thermodynamics, really, and informational entropy being that in every exchange you're going to lose some little bit, and that refinement continues to whittle down the information until it's like at this unanalyzable, sort of like a piece of sake rice being whittled down to its most diminished form, unanalyzable, but at the same time, ironically, it's most meaningful. And I think that's what's interesting about humans. We really like simplicity. I mean, it speaks to us. I do this somatic therapy with my girlfriend, and it's really interesting. she's wonderful, this therapist, and
Mhm.
and she'll have us look at each other and say, it's so silly. I'll be talking up a storm, and she'll be like, Alex, just say me hurt. And I'll be like, oh fuck, all right, me hurt. And it does something. It like simplifying everything, turning everything into just like almost non-verbal, touch and that simplification of information, this entropic thing that we've been sort of convinced ourselves is so bad, and we equate it with decay and all these sorts of things. There's something that we're so attracted to again. And so this idea of us being attracted, it's almost like that death drive notion, but it attracted to further and further reductions, equaling something satisfying.
Well, as a therapist, I can certainly say I deeply appreciate the capacity to bring couples together and have them engage in expressed core affective communication.
Core communication.
Core
right.
communication. That's another. So I'm a theorist on the one hand, and I'm a clinician on the other. So I can definitely appreciate that. So yeah, I like a lot of your thoughts. All I'll just say is same with both energy and information. Okay, those are rightly considered what are called suitcase words. Okay, a suitcase word is a word that has many different potential meanings in them. And if you're not aware of one meaning relative to another, you'll engage in what the sin of equivocation, according to John Vervaeke. And so that is something to be aware of, is that those terms carry the information that's conserved in quantum mechanics and in physics actually isn't the same information exactly that they're talking about in information theory. And that's different than information science, and it's certainly different than semiotics information. So all of those layers are related, but actually you'll shift the meaning in them in particular ways, and then it would be vulnerable to equivocation. But at the same time, for me at least, if you're going to start the process of talking about the core ontology of the universe, energy and information are the two words that you want to introduce into the system to afford our knowledge systems to map the universe in a particular way. They're beautiful words and they're powerful words.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, the informational idea. Once we create that sort of that decoupling of matter from information, just to use the word information in sort of cosmological sense, and part of our cosmogony. Suddenly, I remember the first time I thought of it that way. I just thought of information as the thing that was preserved. And it's just like, all of a sudden, it's like the mind just opened up. It's like, I suddenly have all this space to consider different
Definitely. Things. It affords a powerful fundamental shift in the basic framing, and then opens up all sorts of potential new insights. Certainly it happened to me when I had that sort of learned about that potential framing on the universe.
So when I see your graph and culture, matter, culture, mind, matter, mind, culture. I think culture's at the end right now, right?
Right. It's matter, life, mind, culture. It's 4 different dimensions: matter, life, mind, culture.
So the idea that mind is an emergent property as opposed to a fundamental property, is there something, and when we talk about information, what in your schema creates the operations of intelligence, or the operations of information that eventually produce intelligence? Is it just simply random interaction creating sort of complexities based on what's working and what isn't, and habits formed like that? Or do you assign some sense of intelligence?
Good question. So yeah, a couple of different facets to that answer. So the tree of knowledge maps an unfolding complexified wave, from bang to here. So that's a picture of a complexification. It's basically a negentropic picture. Now I'm inside my naturalistic framework. Okay, so let's stay inside of naturalism. A coherent naturalism basically tracks that information flow through sort of a series of eddies in energy matter flow. Okay, meaning that, yeah, things get pushed around and there's information flow, energy information flow. When you get energy information flow, the potential for complexification emerges. Okay, now the vast majority of the universe, that potential doesn't realize itself, and entropy dominates free energy. Okay, free energy is the capacity of energy to do work. If you get energy flow, you get free energy, and then you can start doing work. And the interesting thing about nature is that it can get free energy, and then you can do work off of that, and then things will work off of that. Okay, so it's definitely not random per se, but it's definitely also not teleologically designed in advance, at least in a naturalistic frame. So it's happening. What are the forces that pull it forward? Okay, now I basically would argue that the metaphysical ontological forces in the matter dimension are essentially random. Okay, meaning that I'm not really a panpsychist. I'm not saying, I find that's not very helpful on ontological claim. Basically, the argument is that in the planet Earth, we'll just say that life begins on Earth. It's not seeded from somebody else. We'll just say, and that, the conditions of possibility for energy information flow on planet Earth afforded themselves eddies of information flow that allowed the system to gain a foothold. And that foothold sets the stage. And that didn't happen on the moon, and it didn't happen on Mars, and it didn't happen in Jupiter, maybe on one of Jupiter's moons, who knows, okay? And maybe somewhere else. But that's the naturalistic frame. Once you get that, you get basically lipids, and you get RNA soup, and somehow RNA soup hooks together with lipids, and somehow, and I'm not a complete expert on the emergence of prebiotic and biotic systems, but I'm following enough to know that, in the naturalistic scientific world, most people, in my opinion, are on the idea that it's mostly a problem, okay, versus a mystery. So mystery means I have no fucking idea how that happens. A problem is, no, I can see the intermediate steps, and we might even be able to develop an experimental paradigm that would actually show this, and by the end of it, build a cell through kind of structuring, electricity and prebiotic soup, and then pushing them through possible phases, and all of a sudden you get on the other side and you get biogenesis. And that's an open question right now. Somebody like Jim Rutt's, like, his analysis of this is still super fucking hard, and I don't see how you get there. So some people think it's a mystery, some people think it's not. I don't think adding the concept of a preordained teleological intelligence of any way affords any naturalistic.
Okay, okay, but then what about? I sort of agree, but I'd like playing around with it in the context of something I presented the other day. Okay, so if we go with the minus plus oscillation thing, and we wonder why a minus happens to begin with, why a and then to really make it mushy but very human, why a lack occurs to begin with, why a gravitational pull, and obviously gravity is clumping things together, and so whatever, but sometimes I just look at the emergence of multicellular organisms, or the emergence of fucking pickles from cucumbers, or cancer, and I just wonder why. Why is the single cell that refuses apoptosis not satisfied to refuse it alone? Why multiply into cancer? Why was the single-celled organism not satisfied? What is it about everything that keeps complexifying? And I like sometimes imagining that everything feels a lack. Everything wants to come back together. Everything wants to complexify. There seems to be some sort of lack desire oscillation.
Beautiful.
And then in the context of lack, I think there's two ways to approach lack. One would be mind, and the other would be memory. But I think that they both imply mind, because you'd have to have something that would be able to recall the memory. And the memory, let's say, being, oh, we were once all together in that tiny little, pre-Big Bang nest, and I remember and want to get back there. Or whatever it is, or it's a memory forward, or it's an idea of some place to be, that magnetic zero concept, that Cynthios concept of something drawing us forward. And if that's applying, if I could apply that to all matter and all complexification, then that would imply that there is something that is desiring from the get-go. There is something that is pulling from the get-go. And you know, it's sort of a stoned musing, but I still think that it's
Totally.
I still think that it's worthwhile in an interesting way. Just because, I guess I'd leave it at.
Well, no, I mean, so there's a couple of different angles on this. Okay, so there's when I say, that's why I preface what I said from my naturalistic standpoint.
Sure.
So when I'm in my naturalistic standpoint, I'm playing by the language game of science in a particular way. And then in the language game of that box, okay, what's justifiable and what's not justifiable. It sounds like, you know, it's mystical musings that doesn't do us any good. Okay. Now, but that's not the only hat to wear. There are mythos hats to wear, in relation, and there are challenging the dominant paradigm and looking at things alternatively. You know, and there's the Wilbur and the Sri Aurobindo and the other perspectives that basically suggest that we're going to wake up, at least depending on how you read them, we're going to wake up to the idea that actually, yes, underneath it all is some genuine kind of consciousness field. Okay. And so from my vantage point, I am completely open to that. I love the mythos of that. I love the creativity of that. I hope that there's truth to that. And I know the rules of science. I'm trained in the rules of science. And it's like, well, justification systems apply different rules. Okay. If you're going to, we get modern science gets started in relationship to what Galileo does to Aristotle's teleological positions of matter. And it's the elimination of that based on certain rules that actually starts the whole thing. So it's a particular, in a context, from a particular angle, you say, nah, it's kind of woo. And from another angle, you're like, that's fucking beautiful. And that's what, and so fire me up and I'll be like, I'll be all there with you, man. The sun god's calling me, brother.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. No, I hear you. I think that justification system dance is important, you know, to unsully, you know, one system and keep it clean from another so that they can produce. But I think as philosophers, like part of the aim is to sort of cross-coordinate and, you know.
Right. Well, that's actually one of the things that you're right. UTOK comes from inside science and basically like, so you guys are all just a bunch of justifiers too, you know. Okay. And scientists don't like that at all, especially physicists. That drives them fucking insane. That I grab their balls by basically, actually, you guys are all justifying too, you know. It's analytic and it's pristine and it's beautiful and it affords a particular picture, but it's all contained in a system of justification. And you actually don't escape that, even with all your damn beautiful theories and experiments. You're all, listen to yourselves as the way you debate. You're all fucking human justifiers. And it's like, whoa, justification, science, just fucking justification system. Whoa. And it's like, yeah, that's what it is. You know, just watch its behavior and you'll be able to see it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I got one more question for you. So there is speaking of Sri Aurobindo, there is a meditation that I learned from Osho, from reading a book, I never met him, that was super helpful to me during a period of my life. And it was, if you are sad or depressed, become more sad or depressed or angry or whatever it is. More. The saddest, most angriest, and eventually, and this is something that I really liked because it played into. I have a card actually similar to the one I sent you, where it's like, you know, you start off angry, sad, more sad, and all of a sudden, a compression happens, a quantitative threshold is surpassed, and a new qualitative shift. It disappears. There's no more relation, and you end up at another equilibrium. And I'm just curious. It used to work for me all the time. As a psychologist, how does that strike you as an approach?
Totally reasonable. Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So have you experienced any, like, that would not be something that wouldn't be advisable, right? You're in a room with a client, you're like, okay, get more, or is that because somatic therapy I think maybe therapy's changed a lot in the last 20 years because.
Well, I mean, so here's the basic task of, so I'm the president of the Psychotherapy Integration Society. Okay. So, the Psychotherapy Integration Society, or really Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, whatever. This is a group of psychotherapists that are saying, what's the underlying processes that we're actually really all about? Like, in fact, my theme for the presidency is toward a common core of psychotherapy. Like, what the fuck's the foundational core? Okay. And I want to help identify what are the problems we actually treat. Okay. So, which are really vicious maladaptive cycles. Okay. Inside of people. People have vicious, and between people. So they're vicious maladaptive psychosocial cycles. That's essentially what we try to treat. Okay. And then there are principles, okay, that we then try to create a healing environment to help put a pause on that, gain insight in that, relate to people so they actually have the right motivation and hope that they might want to change that, and have belief in me that, I can actually help you change that. There's that. Okay. And then there's a particular relational dynamic where I mirror back to you and afford you the opportunity to see yourself in a particular way. Okay. And look to a way you see yourself, and then use a healing therapeutic mirroring relation. And inside of the vast majority of maladaptive structures is essentially an intrapsychic war that happens between various domains of the psyche. Okay. And the core war that essentially happens is, at least in many, is the heart versus head war. Okay. So the heart versus the heart is a motivational affective system that's responding and sending signals and saying, this fucking thing is bad. Usually it's negative affect. Okay. And I need to tell you about this fucking thing. And I need to tell you how bad that is. Okay. The head has negative reactions to these negative feelings. It's like, oh, fuck, there's no point. What the hell? You don't be so negative. This is only going to be a fucking problem. The war between the head and the heart drives a broken, angry, internalized family system that can't get the fuck along. Everybody's defensive. Everybody's pissed. Nobody's happy. Okay. So ultimately, what you have to try to do is to create vertical integration from the body into the heart, into the mind, into the spirit. All right. And there are a whole host of different ways that you want to understand the misalignment that creates bitterness and conflict and reestablish new kinds of alignment. Okay. So the normal reaction of the head to the heart in a neurotic loop is, fuck, I don't want to feel this. God damn it. What the fuck is wrong with me? So what you got trained to do is totally invert the justification narrator and say more of it. Stop resisting it. Give it don't even let it go into it, for the love of Christ. Right. And then all of a sudden you open your psychic structure up and the system initially dumps on you. You'll feel it. You're like, oh, fuck. And the part of you will get anxious. You want to get away. And if you get guided a particular way, okay. So all sorts of techniques to afford exposure to ward it off affects. Okay. Exposure meaning you want to bring it onto the field and reestablish the relationship that the individual has with the affective message. In fact, that's the fundamental core, what we agree to, the core mechanism, the core learning mechanisms of psychotherapy, the corrective emotional experience has to do with the fundamental shift with what the heart system is saying, or body into heart system is saying, to what the mind interprets it as, and affording that, transforming that disintegrated, pissed off, incongruent relation into one that affords a totally different shift that says, oh, you're not doing this to me, you're doing this for me. And this actually teaches me something really important. And by the way, my mind will also reframe the extremes of the affect, like, oh my God, go kill yourself because this is the worst thing ever, to, oh, this really hurts and it means I might be a failure, but that's not the end of the universe. It's like, oh, okay. So the narrator then shifts, the affects shit, and you figure out a way to get them head and heart along, and you undo a neurotic loop and you restore coherent integration, and boom. So yeah, absolutely.
Sure, yeah, and just the acceptance therein and all that. Yeah, I just found it so funny. I forgot one aspect of it. Inevitably, and it was also in the book, he's like, you will start to laugh. And I was like, really? Start to laugh? And it's because an absurd, so much sadness. You push beyond the point of the reality of your sadness until suddenly you're looking at, like, suddenly it's sort of this, you created, it's on the field and you're looking at it now, and you start to laugh at the absurdity. It becomes this sort of non-entity. It's really pretty fucking fascinating.
Yep.
Approach.
I do a same thing with like obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay. So you get OCD, like actually my son had OCD. Okay. So he would have, oh my God, my thought caused this person to be hurt. Okay. Or I cheated and I'm going to get caught, even though he didn't. He's super moral. I cheated and I'm going to get caught. So I bring him into my bedroom, get him situated and actually repeat the thought, I did this. I caused this person damage. I caused it. And you actually have to say it over and over again. Okay. And at first it's like, oh God, I can't believe it. But the first set of 10, no, say it again, another set of 10, another set of 10. Right. And what happens is that you start to habituate and the meaning of it all starts to go away. And all of a sudden it's like, it's like if you say your name over and over again, Alex, 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 and then all of a sudden it just sort of habituates. And now the thought dissipates. Okay.
Right. So or the opposite, you say something like, say your name over and over, and suddenly it starts to sound like a foreign.
Yeah, no, the system basically, opponent process, catches your schematics, catch it, and then you fire it off. And then all of a sudden it's like, all right, this isn't happening. So it starts to reorganize around it. So there's lots of different kinds of processes by which you afford exposure and then a remetabolization of that. And many psychotherapeutic angles are about how to do that in a way that's reliably healing.
I'll say one last thing regarding that I think you might find interesting regarding the compression in music. The compression prevents distortion. So the idea in regard to what we're talking about is like you have this paradigm or justification system or whatever, a reality tunnel, and you have these waveforms. Let's say it's sadness, and you can't imagine being happy. You just, that would be a distortion of your reality tunnel. You can't imagine it. So you have this baseline around which you're oscillating. You're sad, 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 sad. Then let's say you do this exercise, sadder, I'm sadder, I'm sadder, I'm sadder, sad, 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 sad. All of a sudden it becomes congested, it becomes compressed, it becomes saturated, it becomes a flat line, what I call a noise floor. And then a new oscillation begins. Now, when the new oscillation begins, and if you just imagine it, this is sort of silly, but if you imagine it like this is the amplitude of the waveform, then it compresses more and more and more. Now it's a flat line that's this thick. Its flat line was this thin, right? And it was oscillating here. Now it's this thick, this flat line. It's here. The new waveform, its amplitude is much larger compared to the previous amplitude of the previous reality tunnel.
Interesting.
Its new amplitude would have been the distortion in the previous justification system, in the previous sadness. So the new amplitude being happiness and joy was inconceivable here, would have been a distortion. Over here, it's able to do it because its new baseline is the previous impression. So anyway, distortions being what we, like I can't imagine being happy, but then you compress, you create the saturation, and the distortion is able to happen as a non-distortion, as a clean waveform in the next emergence after. I call each of these things super freaks, by the way, and the whole thing I call freak theory. But yeah.
Well, I mean, I believe we're going to, I really believe fluctuation in fields and observer frequency issues are really the proper language. And I think that's true. I think that's going to be, we're going to have the conscious, when we sort of crack some of the nut around consciousness, the neurobiological subconscious field is going to have lots of Fourier wave transformation kinds of framings. And I think your intuition will likely be realized in that regard.
Yeah, I hope so. It feels every time I think about this kind of stuff, I get the same feeling as like I'm like, oh my God, this song. It's like, oh, this idea, it has that same feel to it once in a while. And that does. So, yeah, that's cool. Super cool. So you're doing what's the thing you're doing tomorrow? Or you're publishing it tomorrow? What was that?
Yeah, John Vervaeke and Zach and I did a cognitive science show series. So I did one with John on consciousness. Right. And then John, me, and Christopher Maestro Petro did one on the self. And now John, me, and Zach are doing one on human transformation and a meta psychology that's up to the task. So we'll be, I think there are going to be eight episodes of that. We'll be releasing them every Friday. We've we've done 7 episodes already. So we have basically just one more to do.
So with regard to transcendence is part of the focus?
Well, actually, we framed it in terms of transformation, but yes, we certainly address issues. So what is human transformation? And
that's the same thing to me, but
very similar. And then, so then John problematized human transformation, meaning that's what he likes, sort of like, hey, this makes sense. And then we academically, you think you know what you're talking about. And then, it's all this fucking problem. Then I problematized psychology, it's like, what the fuck is that? Then we sort of created an architecture for human transformation and then handed it over to Zach Stein. Zach is, both meta psychology and his educational transformation time between worlds. Then we riffed off of his structure. And then we backed up and said, what's the is-ought dynamics in relationship to this? And then what is a meta psychology that's up to the task? I actually finished with that, where I said UTOK is at least originally anchored to an exterior epistemology. The yogic tradition, Aurobindo or whatever, is an interior epistemology. I can build a bridge now that goes from energy, matter, life, mind, culture up into higher overmind and supermind. We have an exterior, interior epistemological alignment and have a big naturalistic wisdom worldview. That's up to the task of transformation. We can nail this thing and build a meta psychology that actually is coherent and transformative writ large. So that's basically
and you guys finished it, or you're in the middle of it?
Well, we did 7, and we may or may not do a final one. We may or may not do a final one. Yep. So we'll start releasing those each Friday.
I love it. So you're really into the video format as a sort of a sort of primary means of disseminating, or at least figuring out. I mean, it's as legitimate a form. You're finding it as legitimate a form as anything. In terms of
right, so I'm an old right. So my history is old school academic. I believed in the old school frame. Both my parents are professors and all that. So he's like, oh yeah, academic is where it's at. And then I published. I published all my shit in at various. But really, the institution is baked in. Really, like any institution, it really needs a power-based structure to really influence it. That's what I discovered. And I felt like my ideas, and it's a long, complicated story, but it's like, hey, here's just a much better way of doing psychology. But it had a very limited impact on the institution, even though I published a lot on it and had a potential publishing voice. And over time, I got more and more frustrated. It's like, well, fuck it. You're publishing this, a special issue, blah, blah, blah. These are pretty good journals, but it doesn't do anything. And then in the early 2000s, I shifted and started blogging, became Psychology Today. It's like, I want to talk to people in general. That's when I was more focused on, hey, the psychotherapeutic aspect and try to get that out. Then in 2016, I got insane and did the whole fucking garden and basically I didn't realize it, but I was getting sucked into this meta-modern zeitgeist, basically. And that's now on the outside, this sort of countercultural intellectual futurist thing. I got in a huge fucking fight with my program about Jordan Peterson. So I had a whole microcosm, about that. And, there's a whole story there. And all of that just turned me into I'm now on the outside of the fucking academy looking in, it's just sort of like, even though I'm in the center of it.
You prefer it this way?
Now I'm connecting with people. It's nails on the chalkboard, traditional academics, really. Yeah. And so the whole point of it is a long-winded thing. The dialogos that John and I are doing, as far as I'm concerned, that's much more fucking academically rich, meaningful. Yeah. It's meaningful to do. And if people pay attention to it, then the academic papers I've written in the fucking past, where you write and then somebody puts a commentary and you write back to them. And it's all, you never actually talk to them. You just write, you try to undermine their justification and show why your justification's accurate. And they try to critique it. There's no fucking shared, sense of, well, actually, you've got a good point about this. And because it's all written, it's 5 months apart and then everything gets published and your whole ego's on it. It's fucking I'm telling you, man, this Zoom, the beauty of this fucking Zoom is like, we can actually come together. Oh, that's a great point, blah, 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 and co-create a shared distributed intelligence that, is relational and dialogical.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
so I love it. I'm loving it. It's a lot. I'm better suited for it. It's much more fun. and I think it has much more opportunity to actually impact, and I think it's really needed. I mean, I think the meaning mental health crisis is real, and it's like, what the fuck, we definitely, the digital is going to create all those waves. Look at the world already, fucking environmental shit. We need, and then we can hook up with artists, hook up with artists and leaders and everything. I would never fucking talk to I love it. I'm a super happy camper.
Awesome. Are you guys going to translate any of the elusive eye or any of those things? Have them whatever.
Like transcribed or anything like that?
Transcribed, yeah.
I haven't really thought so much about that. What I've told John is that I'm in the midst of a book right now, but I hope to finish it up by this calendar year. One cool little book I would like to do is and I would take the lead on it potentially, is I think that my system with John solves, a while ago, identified 5 core conceptual problems in psychology of concepts, okay? Psychology itself, but the fundamental concepts of behavior, mind, cognition, consciousness, and the self, okay? Like those are the terms we work in, and we don't know what the fuck they mean at all right? So my syncing up with John, basically, in my estimation, and what we can show is actually we have a naturalistic framework for those big 5 terms: behavior, mind, cognition, consciousness, and the self. We can now metaphysically and ontologically specify what those terms are, and that's a big fucking deal. So I have, one of my next book projects, if John wants to do it, would be, solving psychology's big 5 conceptual problems, and do a short little book on, an intro chapter, a chapter on each one of those. That would build basically right off of the series, and, certainly wouldn't transcribe all of that, but it would afford an entry point into what the real intellectual architecture that we laid out would afford us as a culture or whatever.
That's cool, man. It's fun to be privy to all this, and to see all of the it's fun to just see people like you and people like situations like yours shift in the way that they do, and then it's like watching from the outside is, I've heard, of course, all the complaints and, oh no, and we're being and we're not able to do our position, our university gig here, and we don't have, but watching from the outside, I'm like, this is the birth of the new cool. This affords philosophy a return to heroism. I'm sorry, this is the best thing that could have possibly happened for philosophy, is like all of this melee. And in the interim, people's lives are hard. And like when that guy Michelle was like, I'm being canceled and all that, it's like, that's legit. But zooming out, it's like, this is the transformation. And that's basically exactly what happened to me too. There was a cabal of woke people that came after me as a conservative white guy. Right. Me. I'm like, I'm woken up to feminism in 1987. I woke up to feminism, and I'm the conservative white guy who, utilizes my sexuality to control people. That's why I ended up hooked up with Bard and be like, oh my God, this woke thing's fucking insane, Insane.
But anyway, there it is.
Yeah. It's good stuff.
Hey man, I'm really glad we got a chance to.
I'm glad too. What's that? Yeah.
I just said I'm glad we got a chance to sync up.
Sure. Same. Yeah, for sure. And if you ever want to talk in the future about anything, or as things develop, I'm working on this. I'm working on this movie for the freak theory thing, and by way of doing, I'm animating it with all those drawings. So it's very difficult and in depth. But what's fun, I think, about working primarily visually with an idea in mind is that I end up having to actually solve real fucking problems with the theory because of the visual. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh, this visual doesn't actually quite represent it, and that will lead me down a wormhole. All of a sudden I'll be like, oh my God, because it has to be this or that, and oh my God, the visual is telling me. So I think that, as we enter the sort of like post-script world, and back into sort of a world of imagery, these things you talk about, like these sort of visual teachings, will have that much more sort of impact, and lead our philosophical endeavors in a way. At least that's what's happening with me. So it's kind of fun.
Well, certainly very few people in the academy work in visual logic graphics,
Right.
But
Right.
that's what the whole tree of knowledge was a visual logic graphic, and that's what I grounded my shit in. And the whole argument was actually the modalities of vision, geometric logic, and justificatory narrative logic actually need to correspond. And you cannot, it affords a huge amount of cross-validation to line up your visual logic with your narrative logic in a particular way.
And to see something on a wall, it's like, oh, you have a story, put it on cards, let's see it on the wall. And then you're like, oh, actually, until you see everything out in front of you, it's like the football field analogy. You want to get a patient's all their stuff out in the field. And that's the case with any one of these justification systems. Okay, let's get everything out there and actually see if any of these things make sense, and then consilience across different systems. And so anyway, I think it's cool because visually we can actually put it outside of ourselves and see it. We can't do that really with just reading words and going to other reading where we have to kind of see.
Right. And obviously the digital virtual world is going to, that's going to both afford it and demand it. And the people that do it are going to lead it and all that shit. So I totally 100% agree. Really enjoyed talking. So so as I told people, I'm basically a free public intellectual. If you find yourself, wrangling with some theoretical issues, feel free to shoot me a note, and I'll be happy to serve.
Oh, that would be great. I'm always up for one of those things. I would love that. Thanks, Greg. And if you have any, likewise, you need some outside the box, random aside. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's what's his name? It's one of my favorite producers. Anyway, he has this thing called oblique strategies. He's what's his name? Anyway, it's one of my favorite producers. Oblique strategy is just a deck of cards. You're in the studio, you don't know what to do. You pull out an oblique strategy, and it tells you to go sit on your head and someone bangs a tambourine on your ass or whatever it is, and you have to go do it. And then the idea is that by doing something that's interjecting upon your general, your normal,
totally,
you end up with something. So if you need an oblique strategy, I'm your guy.
Love that. That's great. Yeah. I can. Hey, man, that's a good lack desire balance, and I'll find some oscillation, and I'll keep you in mind in relationship to that.
All right. All right, Greg.
All right, man. Really enjoyed it. And I don't know if you want to do anything with this recording, but maybe
I thought it was actually a pretty good conversation. So maybe it would be fun to.
I can put it up on my just general TOK channel and share it with the IDW if you want.
Yeah, I think that in a way it's I don't know. I got a much better sense of the UTOK vision. So maybe it'll be I don't know, helpful.
I'll put it up, not as official podcast because I didn't do the normal introduction, but I'll put it up on my TOK channel if you're good with that. And
awesome.
we'll share it with the IDW. Okay.
Love it.
And by the way, I do have I'm going to push pause.